Okay, video message for Andrew Rose in lieu of a podcast that we can't seem to record because my internet is bad today. He and I are both interested in collective consciousness and community and what it looks like for people to people really well together. And we're kind of coming at this from two very different angles, where his has a lot of very concrete stuff. He's working on this community house, and he's working on trying to get his friends to start teams working on projects together and stuff like that. And my work has been oriented a lot to things more around the subtle nuances of what it means for people to be conscious together. And so I'm going to try to bridge a little bit between those. So his theory, I think, which I have a lot of appreciation for, is something about if people are sufficiently healthy, then rather than doing introspective practices and self-therapy and whatever, just go start companies, work on meaningful stuff. And I'm hugely in favor of this, with the caveat that it's very easy to get into a mode that's kind of companies often run slack into the ground. And so the approach that I like is something like, do as much as you can, but then if you get blocked on doing stuff, you want to be able to slow down and really look at those blocks rather than kind of build up technical debt. And when I say technical debt here, I do mean in the sort of company sense of having old code that's muddy that you aren't finding time to go back and fix. But I also mean in the personal sense, you can have psychological technical debt, which is basically a way of saying that you have coping mechanisms layered on top of coping mechanisms, layered on top of coping mechanisms, and they're all load bearing, so you can't kind of go down and fix any of them, and you're stressed because you've got deadlines this week. So getting into a situation like that, it diminishes sanity overall. And so even if you have really good output, there's a kind of shear against something that would feel more alive and integrated. And so I'm wary of situations when projects will produce intense deadlines for long periods of time. A one-off intense deadline is fine, but ongoing intense deadlines are a sign that you are going to be in a kind of panic mode rather than in a more kind of, sustainably integrated mode. And so I'm in favor of people sort of something like trying to do as much as possible, working really hard. And I mean, I have this app called Intend, which is all about helping people set goals and, drive towards those. And sometimes people, and I've been there, set a business goal and a fitness goal and some learning goal or whatever, and they kind of forget the social side, and they gotta go tack on a social goal to this whole thing. I actually care about community too, because you can get so driven into the things that you're tracking that you forget to look at the other stuff. So, but I am in favor of people really sort of seeing how hard they can push themselves when that pushing of themselves feels good. And having a project is definitely an amazing way to do that. Most of my learning to code came from making this app, not from studying how to code or whatever, but just by having an actual business that was actually helping people and finding more problems that needed solving as part of running that business. And it was really, really great for me that I was able to do that in a kind of fluid amount of time rather than having to sort of, rather than getting burned out by how I was working. But there's ways to do that. There's ways to build an organization that function in that way. There are a lot of other issues I could say about organizations, but I don't know, read an everyone culture or something for a take on that. So that's kind of one dimension of things. My gloss there would be something like push as hard as you need to, but also be willing to kind of ease off when the pushing is kind of gotten into some sort of dead end. The second dimension is something like, and this is a different dimension of sustainability. So I was saying to Andrew, and he kind of asked me about this. I guess it's unclear now if I'm in first or second person. Am I talking to you, Andrew, or am I talking to the internet? And by the way, Andrew, but whatever, here it goes. So there's this question that you had around, like I had said something about like having experienced these really profound tastes of collective consciousness, like a feeling of being awake together in relation to, I'm gonna say in relation to kind of like a fully general and open sense of what matters. And I think that's importantly different. So like I've been trying, this is I could record a whole video just on this thing. But I have been trying to figure out what it means for people to be in like, what is the kind of state that I've been in, basically. Flow seems like a really key piece of it. And the latest dimension of it that I feel like I've gotten is that like it's one thing for athletes to be experiencing flow like while playing a game together, or people working, doing a video game or anything like that. And there's other kinds of flow that people have together. You can be experiencing a kind of collective flow with somebody that you are sparring with. So it's not just flow collaboratively, but also there's competitive flow too, and so forth. But this seems sort of, whatever it is that I've been experiencing and focusing on a lot, seems like it's not just flow, sort of obviously. And it seems to be that it's something like flow on the dimension of meaning making. So if meaning making is an activity, what is it like to have flow in that activity with other people? And that this seems to involve and require and produce, like there's a kind of dynamo of increased openness and curiosity and capacity for deep listening and capacity to allow what the other person is saying to really affect you and touch you, to sort of let it in and see what arises, and something like be willing to go there, which can be very intimate and can be also quite dangerous, like quite, you run the risk of finding your way into a quality of intimacy with somebody, or finding their thinking affecting your thinking in a way that you hadn't necessarily intended to sign up for. And this is, I think, also one of the things that, I was telling Andrew, I'm so confused about who I'm talking to here. I'm going to try to talk directly to you, Andrew, even though I know this is intended to go on YouTube. So I was telling you about these states and saying, if they could be sustained, it feels like something really compelling would happen because of the sense of sanity that's involved here. And I have found this to be such a mysterious process. One of the things I've noticed is that there seems to be a way in which it would seem like one of the things that can get in the way is that people can be in this kind of flow state with each other, but without having fully brought all of themselves into the room. And so it'll feel like, wow, we're so sane together, we're including everything, but it's a kind of like a secret, not totally everything. It's everything I am aware of right now, I can bring up with you. And that's really cool. That is an experience of remarkable transparency. But if that's achieved via compartmentalizing away the things that I can't bring up with you, then that's inevitably not going to be sustainable, because those things I'm compartmentalizing away are going to spring back later. And this is related to the phenomenon that's referred to as reality distortion fields. When people, Steve Jobs having a famous one of those, like, you're around him and like, whoa, different stuff seems possible than it otherwise does. And, different stuff seems important, seems relevant, and so on. And it's like, part of how, in my understanding, and this is, I might have a different understanding of this in a few years, but my understanding is part of how that happens is that there's an invitation into a kind of meaning-making flow that is also suppressing or rejecting certain other ideas. And so it's that's what creates this kind of oscillation effect, where when you're outside of the person's presence, you're like, wait, that doesn't make sense, because you're suddenly aware of all these other things. So a powerful field of meaning flow, which is like one thing you could call, it's a different way you could talk about the reality distortion field. Reality and meaning are very closely intercoupled. um, that powerful field is a great way to rally a bunch of effort towards something, but it is also kind of by definition, if it has that kind of intensity, even if it's functioning by pushing other things out of awareness, it's going to always also have friction involved. And maybe what's happening is exciting enough that people are willing to show up and do it anyway. And, maybe what's happening is also making enough money that people are willing to take a job doing this kind of thing. But it's still, there's a kind of background friction. There's a kind of, things getting left out, and it tends to sort of have a one directional-ish hierarchical flow to it. So sustainable. Yeah. What would it mean if it were sustainable? The feeling is one of, and I could say more about I think there's different kinds of this collective meaning flow that people get into, some of which are, you could also talk about a collective meaning flow that is not just leaving out certain ideas, but is actively hostile to groups of people. Acts of violence have been committed on a large scale by people who are in a kind of collective meaning flow. And so obviously we need some additional elements in order to talk about something that would be not just transformational and powerful, but also integrated and loving. But there has been a kind of meaning flow that I've tasted that has a kind of intrinsic loving quality to it. And it feels like if that were sustained, there would be an experience of something like an ability to make collective decisions together, where the decisions would be kind of sustainable and what do I mean by sustainable? So it's like if you have a group of people and they make a decision, it's not, I think, uncommon to have that decision somehow make sense while everyone's in the room, and then they go off to do their parts, and their motivation kind of either gradually kind of, or it just kind of immediately plummets. And sometimes this is very concrete. It's, there's some next step that needs to talk to somebody else, and you actually can't do it on your own. And you just need to notice that and then message the person, actually, I need to get that thing from you in order to do the thing. But other times it's because in the excitement of the momentum that the group had, you had some sort of dissonance that you didn't feel able to voice. And so as a result, a decision was made which, given all the information in the room, seemed like, yes, this is what we want. But in fact, there was hidden information that actually said, this is a bad idea, maybe. I mean, maybe, right? Like maybe it's a good idea, but at any rate, the group did not actually decide with all the information. They decided with some fraction of the information. And so as a result, they can't, when people go to try to move forward with things, there's a sense of again, a kind of friction that arises from something that was not accounted for in the collective thinking. So what I would imagine, if you had a group that was doing this in a more sustainable way, which again is not, from my perspective, about trying to sustain it, but is actually about trying to fold everything into it in such a way that it doesn't take effort to sustain, because all of the facets of everybody are already brought into the thing in the first place. But that is a process. That is a learning process, learning to do that. If you had that, then you'd have a group of people with a kind of quality of sort of something like unified will to do whatever it is that they wanted to do. And I would say it's not particularly the case that most individuals have that much unified will as well. You can cultivate that will in various kinds of ways. You can also sort of use fear to, whether that's fear of the world ending or fear of not being loved if you don't do a cool enough thing, you can also use fear to kind of push yourself in a given direction. Again, against some friction from some part that doesn't want that. And this shows up on interpersonal as well as individual scales. This is such a lovely ramble rant thing. Anyway, all that to say, yeah, like the experience of unified will would mean something like anything that the group is in principle capable of and wants to do, they could do. And they would have the capability of figuring out what, in fact, they want, in fact, to do. And that is itself, this brings me to your third question about like, what is this if it's not just introspecting and not just, psychological fixing yourself or healing yourself or whatever. I see it as a kind of collective relevance realization, which is to say, John Vervaeke has this term, relevance realization, which is a reference to the evolutionary process by which our minds somehow solve the frame problem in practice remarkably well, managing to combinatorically, managing to filter what could be something like terabytes per second, maybe petabytes per second of data, although this is a pretty bad way to think about it, to be honest, but an incredibly intense incoming stream of stuff, along with all of our memories of everything. Our minds manage to somehow find relevance and continually evolve a relation of relevance to what is happening. And I say minds, not brains, because what I'm referring to here is the essence of what mindness is. And you can actually model when people are talking. Like one way to model what's happening when people are talking is that they are communicating. They are transmitting information. I have things to say and I am saying them. They are going to you, and then you are receiving the information, and then you are transmitting a response back to me. This model, this kind of transactional information exchange model, is just one way to think about what a conversation is. A different way to think about what a conversation is that it is a mind thinking together. Like thinking, and the mind is composed of multiple brains in the same way that it is composed of multiple mouths, multiple eyes, well, more than just two eyes, but 4 or 6 or whatever, multiple heartbeats, but the mind can be looked at on the level of the group. This is kind of riffing on some of Gregory Bateson's stuff, and some interesting tie-ins here too with Michael Levin and so on, who talks about how intelligence shows up at the level of cells. Anyway, when you look at it as a mind, then there's this question of how do we collectively realize, make real to ourselves what is relevant to us. And that relevance can range from a spectrum depending on the nature of the collective that you're dealing with. So on the level of something like a family, you're working with the question of, well, like, basically just like, what are our needs and wants? What would it feel like to have an amazing day out today as a family, for instance? And somehow managing to surface what is so for everybody in a way that yields doing something that feels really satisfying as a family, which could mean doing something all together. It could also mean splitting up, depending, if someone in the family really wants to just spend all day lazily reading a book and the rest of everybody wants to go for a hike, then hopefully there's able to be a collective felt sense of yes towards that possibility. Or there's able to be a felt sense of, well, I really would like to read, but you guys all really want to go for the hike, and I would like to spend the day with you. So I will come on that hike with you. And it's not a compromise. It's a sense of that is actually in the circumstances what I want. And I can tell that I'm not getting ripped off in terms of what I want and what you want and our ongoing relationship. I can tell that this is actually on balance what I want. Now, if it always went the one way, the person would start to be like, well, no, hang on. I want something different this time. Can we find a different thing? And there would be a collective feeling into that. So on the level of something like the archetype of a family, the wanting is sort of just what we want personally. And you're sort of taking for granted that it's going to be this family. You're not going to boot someone out because they don't want the right thing, even if they're going to do something different for today. On the level of a team, kind of at the other far extreme, you have, here is a thing that's happening. And if you want to contribute to that thing in a way that works with everybody else, then you can join and contribute. But if you don't, then kind of too bad-ish. Or not too bad, but just like you want to go do something else. And we're not going to change what it is that we're doing very much to meet what the team members feel like doing. That's sort of, there's an extreme version of a team like that. And there's also teams that are very much in between. And so you could imagine an example where, somebody, a team, a particular art team, or let's say an a cappella group decides that they want to take on a competition together. And there's one person in the group who doesn't actually want to practice that much. They might just say to the group, I don't want to actually practice and travel for this competition. You'll need to find another beatboxer or another bass singer or whatever. And so in that context, there's kind of a fixed sense of the relevance of what the team is even there to do in the first place. And the membership can be fluid as part of realizing that relevance. And in a sense, there are many companies today who have no original employees, including companies that are so old that there's nobody even alive anymore who was working at that company when it, in its early years. But somehow the company continues to have such a mission. So again, there's a sense in which all human groups are already doing this. But there's a thing it feels like to feel like you're doing it well. And it seems like I'm confused about this because, I've spent a long time trying to sort of optimize for this and at times feeling like I'm going in circles. But I've recently come to appreciate that if I'm really listening to myself, I can something like at least tell if we're making progress. I can't necessarily tell how fast that progress is or how soon we'll get to any level in particular. And with some of the things I'm doing, I'm definitely realizing I want to have more like trying actual stuff versus just trying to iterate on the collective consciousness without sort of anything to apply it to. I've been realizing there's something I've been missing there. But there is also a sense in which it feels like there is compounding marginal returns to having a group that is, somewhat on the same page, mostly on the same page, almost entirely on the same page, or entirely on the same page, whatever entirely means. And I'm thinking about Dave Chapman's writing here about meaning and the sense in which there is, if I say, do you know what I mean? And you go, yeah, I know what you mean. And I go, yeah, it seems like you do. That's all with respect to some purpose. It's never sort of exact and 100%, but it can be entirely adequate for a given purpose. If I say, so then you're going to want to hang up the keys on the second hook inside the door, and you're like, got it. Like, we can be fairly confident that you've got it. There is one second hook inside the door, and you're good to go. Now, if you said, oh, hey, I'll go put these up in your bedroom. And I'm like, oh, wait, my bedroom's actually a different bedroom than the one it was last time you were visiting. I might be like, wait, actually, you need to know that. It's a missing piece of information. I actually don't know that you know what I mean. So, in some sense, yes, some amount of purpose needed. I think ambitious purpose, also great, as long as the ambitious purpose doesn't cause a buildup of a kind of pressure to do the object level thing that makes it harder and harder to get deeply in sync and leads to burnout and leads to oscillation and leads to doing things in ways that people can tell is wrong with their soul in some way. Like a lot of companies are doing things that like don't feel spiritually right. Even if the company is producing a bunch of amazing shit, it might also be polluting the environment or subtly overworking its people or, like a bunch of people at OpenAI literally think that the thing they're building might end humanity. And they're just like, well, I guess we've got to build it anyway. And there's sort of an inability to slow down and be like,
is this a good idea? Like there's a kind of pressure that makes that difficult. So the puzzle is, how do you have and this is the kind of pressure. I mean, there's a quote that says it's nearly impossible to get someone to understand something if their job depends on not understanding it. And that can be one of the downsides of taking on a big concrete project, is you get invested in the specifics of it, and this makes it harder to listen to each other and harder to listen to the world, and harder to listen to your own soul, which is to say your own sense of what is truly alive and meaningful and worth pouring your life into. And this creates friction. And so I overall have the sense that as people get increasingly able to, through doing self-therapy type stuff, through doing circling, whatever, like there's definitely an attractor where people don't do stuff, but I do feel overall excited that we also can do a lot of stuff. And I'm interested in experimenting with that. I have a lot of writing that you may have seen about stuff around my notion of meta team, which involves people finding the things that they are so motivated to do that once they're aware of them and somewhat enabled to do them, it would take more energy to resist doing them. Like that's how much motivation there is. And sort of finding, companies or teams can represent win-wins in that space, where it's like, I really want to do this half of the business and not that half, you're vice versa. And so when we come together, it's like there's net energy unleashed by us working together, rather than it sort of being like, well, yeah, I guess I'll do that because I have to do something to make money. But it's sort of not as, the money's not enabling me to do something I'd want to do anyway. It's just sort of getting me to do something. Obviously, there's going to be some work that's a bit like that, but this is one of the exciting things about automation, is that we might actually be able to have a world where there's very little stuff like that, and it can pay quite lucratively because, it's, yeah. So, wow, what a long rant. This is, I think, my longest solo video. I have longer videos on my YouTube, but I don't know that I've ever just talked into the camera for 27 minutes straight. Definitely, I feel a sense that this is possible and reasonable in part because I have a particular person whose questions I'm answering. Yeah. Shoot me back some more thoughts, Andrew. If anybody else has watched this whole thing, say hi in the comments, because probably you're interested in related stuff, and me and Andrew might like to know you. You are, of course, free to keep lurking, but yeah, I would like my comments to be a place where interesting people hang out. So, yeah.